Rocket ship go now. Hello, I am Robert Ogilvy, Executive Strategist and EQ Coach. Glad you could join me here today. Why am I wearing this somewhat silly mask? Well, we all wear masks, metaphorically speaking. Um, this is actually part of an EQ exercise that we went through yesterday. But actually, the notion of wearing masks and how we wear masks is important, and it becomes really important as a leader. And there's a lot of ways to operationalize it. But when I'm saying manager, I'm normally meaning that you have, a team, maybe a few teams, but normally one team that you have direct reports with, right? Um, and so you could think of those as first degree connections. Well, one way to think of being a leader is that as you have not just more people that you manage, but more second and third degree connections of people that you need to connect with, influence, steer in the right direction, align to a strategy, whatever it is. That there's a skill around how you do that, right? And so that responding appropriateness, but even just in a very small scale sense, what are people expecting and what's needed and what's useful is part of why we make masks, right? So like the societal root of this is actually around relationships and exchange. Um, if you go back to the classic Stoics and they're first like contemplating like what is the nature of society, one and I can't remember if this is Plato or Aristotle, but they're arriving at some kind of micro conclusion around specialization, right? So I think they say something like, okay, well, as opposed to everyone having to do everything for themselves, it's like, okay, well, at the simplest kind of unit, if you're the farmer and you can make a bunch of food, and you're the house builder architect guy and you can make houses and shelter for us, and you're the soldier guy that can keep us safe, like the three of us don't all have to do that ourselves. Like we can specialize and need to work together. But also what that means is like we're cooperating and exchanging. And so it's like, hey, of all the things you could be, you be soldier, you be architect, you be farmer, and this is all going to work out. Is someone fundamentally, mystically, in some predestined sense, farmer, soldier, architect? No, those are kind of roles they're falling into. Now they might have skills, aptitudes, values that make them more inclined to do that, but that's still kind of a role they're taking on, and then that allows them to add value to others in a certain way, right? That's in some sense also the nature of when we're talking about career and skill development. It's like why build up a skill set? It's like it's useful to me, it's useful to others, right? And then that becomes, why would you train in some very deep, advanced professional skill set? It's like it adds a lot of value. It's more financially and status-wise more value to you, and it's also just a better fit for your skills, right? So there's nothing inherently wrong about masks, but it can also become draining if we always need to wear masks. So I'm going to get into what this dance is. And here are the two extremes we're actually trying to avoid in this whole leadership mask management end of things. If someone always has a mask on, they come off as inauthentic. And what this normally comes out of is someone that thinks or operates like, there's an appropriate way to respond to everything, right? There are particular needs, and I'm going to kind of adapt and show whatever side they need, and you could see how, certain politicians might really pride themselves on being good at that. Or normally what we think of statecraft has that tone, right? Everyone has a certain need, you show them the face they want, and that's it, right? That's how you get influence. But actually, people are more clever than you think. And even if you're fulfilling the kind of short-term situational need, they can see that there's an inauthenticity there, right? And so someone who always has a mask on, we see that we're never getting beneath the surface. There's lots of drivers for a perfectionism and a not wanting to fail is one, but kind of needs around having to have a lot of influence and power. I mean, it can fall into a kind of Machiavellianism, is maybe a darker way to frame that, right? So if you always have a mask, it's like people realize that and they don't trust you. They actually see you as a bit untrustworthy, a bit dishonest, right? Other extreme, you never wear a mask, right? Well, actually, masks are part of how we build up our social and career personas, and that we are sensitive to needs and context, to people's needs around us, right? So if you never learned to wear a mask, there's, really you're at risk for being very insensitive, not aware, not concerned about others, or even on a little bit psychotic level, just aloof, just out of touch, right? So if you see someone on the end of the spectrum that's saying, "Oh, I never wear a mask," you want to think, "What the hell's up with this person?" Or back to the context end of things, like, listen, if you're in a retreat scenario or you've been some deep meditation, deep monastic practitioner for years, yeah, because you're in this kind of not just safe, but kind of low, no performance context where you don't need to do much, right? So there's not a lot of social output exchange that needs to happen. So you can be relatively maskless, but it also means, frankly, you're relatively useless, right? Which brings us back to the core utility of why do we wear masks? To help each other to get things done. Okay, so I'm going to take this off because sometimes it irritates my nose just a smidge. So why is this a particular good art for leaders to learn? Um, it takes energy to wear a mask, so you don't always want to be draining yourself. But the other stat you may have heard from me or Melissa Landry is that as much as there's a proper bell curve, there's a proper distribution of introverts and extroverts and where they are on the spectrum of things. Um, Only 4% of executive leaders are introverts. Most are extroverts. Okay, why would that be? Okay, so one reason is that they need to influence people at the executive level. Back to the how I started this, you need to influence lots of people. You have a lot of second and third degree connections. You have a lot of indirect connections. You also have more first degree connections that you need to influence. If we look at this even from a network connection standpoint, good executive leaders, good directors and board members have such market reach that they have all these relationships they can pull in, right? That's part of influence, and that's part of the mass of how can I help you, how can you help me, but like setting up these different win-win scenarios and just getting really good and efficient, even generous at that, right? So on the far end of, let's say, Adam Grant's, takers, matchers, givers, he talks about giver advantage, right? You could see how someone that had a lot of resources and influence, they might have giver advantage, because there is like they have something to give, they have something useful to give, but also it's like they're trying to look for long-term opportunities. So there's a certain even time threshold of being able to get things back, right? That's part of the art of influence. Most executives, I think the stats are something like two-thirds, 75% of executives fail within 18 months, some much shorter than that. There's four high-level reasons. Two are basically business strat related. The other two are leadership related. They actually can't get the amount of buy-in they need. Well, you're not using your masks right. If that's the case, you're not listening to what other people are needing. You're not forming a relationship based off mutually fulfilling those needs and hopefully accomplishing other things. Um, and you're also just unaware of context. I mean, to give you this kind of high level scenario, right? New CEO comes in. I got a plan. I spent a week consulting with people. I think I have a rough sense. I don't need any more data. We're gonna do this, right? So for starters, your plan is half baked, which itself means you didn't leverage enough of your pull enough intel and get enough of your people, particular people intel, enough of your experts and managers on side to be like, what are you thinking? What do you think might win here? But you also didn't spend enough time building up goodwill and relationships so that you can influence people. You haven't managed your mask well, right? Um, and this is basically a critical job for you as a leader. This is part of, long term, you could think of this as part of the transformational leadership of building up people's capacity and delegating to them. But it's also part of strategy in terms of like, let's have a shared mental model, which is part of the strategy we're going after that makes sense for us, which helps prioritize our decisions and align our resources, right? You need that influence. You need that connection. You need those appropriate masks to build those relationships and pull that intel you need to make those kind of decisions. Masks are incredibly important, which is really just to say, in some sense, when we're talking about masks, if you look at some of the stuff, particularly around authentic leadership, that we'll just frame it as, listen, there's a lot of intrapersonal stuff, and in that sense, the mask, or whether we're wearing a mask, is like, are we in touch with our values and motivation? What do we want? Are we self-aware? And then the more self-aware we are about what we value and what we're about, that can lead us to actually becoming more conscientious because we know what we want to focus on and put effort into and organize around, right? And then the other part is just interpersonal. Are you sensitive? Are you aware of what people need? And is that then able that empathy, that adaptability, that ability to explore new win-win, is that part of how you set up relationships? Again, we know from an EQ competency standpoint, all managers and executives need to build up navigate emotions and optimism. The managers first need to focus on the noble purpose, which is about setting up these win-win, long-term, big impact. And then the executives need to actually build up their intrinsic motivation because faced with all this strategic options and choice and freedom and futures, they need to be able to like conceive this thing out of nowhere and like will it into being, right? This requires really intrapersonally being in touch with yourself. Okay. Masks are great. They're not totally good. They're not totally bad. They're super useful. They're part of how we serve people's needs and they're part of how we influence others. Masks, learn to use them well because it's a critical leadership critical leadership skill.